Let me apologize to many of you who were misled either by an early announcement of this series or by, if I may use the phrase, the Daily Bruin today, that suggested this lecture was to go forward in Moore Hall. It was in fact originally scheduled for Moore Hall, but by virtue of the phone calls and communications to the staff of the Committee on Public Lectures, it seemed quite clear that the interest was far beyond the capacity of that hall. Hence its change, and we're sorry that it inconvenienced some of you. I'm delighted to be able to preside briefly at this first lecture of the all-university faculty lecture series this year in order to pay tribute primarily to the record of the Committee on Public Lectures here at UCLA. Its record through the years is an extraordinary one, and under its auspices, a variety of distinguished personalities have been brought to this campus, a group of people that indeed run the whole spectrum of the most gifted in the Western world today. Committee on Public Lectures decided some few years ago, as a part of its overall program, to take advantage of the advantages that come to it and to us by virtue of being part of this consortium of campuses which is called the University of California. It was decided, therefore, to try to put together a lecture series, among others, which would take advantage of the great variety and range and quality of talent that lies within this vast university system. And I am very glad, as I say, to pay tribute on behalf of my colleagues here at UCLA, pay tribute through this lecture series to the resources that we can mobilize on a voluntary basis. A quality of resources, I insist, that would match those to be found any place in the civilized world. This year, it was decided that the all-university faculty lecture series would concern itself with the concept, nuances of nonverbal communication. May I remind you, and take an additional minute or more to do so, of the full range of this series. Beyond this evening, on March 3rd, Professor Thomas Parkinson, professor of English at Berkeley, will be on this campus to speak about the written word in communication. On March 10th, Professor Adrian Wenner, a biologist at Santa Barbara, will talk on communication in lower animals. On March 17th, Howard Warshaw, professor of art at Santa Barbara, will talk on the subject Vision Made Visible. On March 24, Harold Weaver, professor of astronomy at Berkeley, will talk under the title Hello Out There. And finally, on March 31, the inimitable William W. Melnitz of UCLA will talk on dance, music, theater as forms of communication. And I do hope that the majority of you will be able to be in attendance at all of these. This evening, it will be your pleasure to hear a lecture by Dr. Sidney Cohen, New York born, New York and German educated. He is presently chief of the psychiatric service at the Wadsworth Veterans Administration Hospital and is associate clinical professor of medicine in UCLA. Dr. Cohen has done extensive research and published broadly in the area of tonight's talk. generally in the field of sensory and extrasensory perception, including the effect of psychochemical drugs on the senses, including, for example, LSD. Perhaps his most well-known publication is adroitly entitled The Mind Within, The Beyond Within, and he's the editor of Mind, Psychiatry and General Practice, and a member of all of the important medical and psychiatric associations. After Dr. Cohen's talk, he will receive questions from the audience. Moderator will be Professor Murray Schwartz, Professor of Law in UCLA and Chairman of the Committee on Public Lectures on this campus. It is now my great pleasure to present to you then the first lecturer in this series, Dr. Sidney Cohen, who will talk on the subject of sensory and extrasensory communication. Dr. Cohen.
Chancellor Murphy, ladies and gentlemen, I'm tempted very much right now to change the title of my talk to Hello in Here. I've been asked to make an announcement which is unnecessary for some of you who got here early and who received a brochure, but they ran out quickly. There will be a 2-day seminar on extrasensory perception, fact or fantasy, here at Royce Hall, June 5th and 6th of this year, at which time some of the greatest protagonists and antagonists of this question will appear on this platform and deal with this subject. June 5th and 6th, a weekend, and we hope that you'll all be here. People such as Mr. Gerald Hurd, Dr. Gardner Murphy, Joseph Pratt, and many other very well-known people will review their work. What I'd like to do this evening will be to deal with 3 areas of perception or communication. One, what we generally accept as normal sensory perception. Another, what might be called metasensory perception, an area which lies out a little outside of general acceptance, and then extrasensory perception. This will be a sort of exercise almost as much in belief systems as in communications and in perception. The frontiers of the senses has been pushed forward during the past century to an incredible degree. Science and technology have required and contributed to this vast expansion of our sensory capability. It's become necessary to see beyond the resolving power of the ultramicroscope, to track the electron's course through a cloud chamber, and beyond that. At the other end of the visual spectrum, we've seen the moon's surface as though it were only a few city blocks away. We have radio transmitted visual knowledge of galaxy 3C295, which is 60 trillion light years away, our sun being some 10 light minutes away. We now have techniques to see through steel, darkness, fog, and people. Similar extensions of our sound spectrum are available, but much less so for taste and smell. These latter senses collect immediate, close-in data, much less important these days than the distant information out there. These accelerated expansions of our perceptual boundaries compete with a steep exponential increase in the techniques of dissemination of verbal communication, the accumulation of knowledge, and the construction of data processing equipment. What lags far behind the information and communication explosions is the wisdom to synthesize the available bits of information. And far back at the baseline, human emotional growth is at a standstill, or it sometimes seems regresses to even more primordial levels. This discrepancy between burgeoning information, which is power, and the ability of our species to deal with its consequences through mental and emotional maturation is what makes this the century of uncertainty. Now, it's not my intent to deal with the latter-day technological elaborations of our sensory input. We seem, however, to be paying a price for this glut of sights and sounds that now assail our receptor organs. We appear to sit at a continuous sensory feast that overwhelms our ability to appreciate and discriminate and dulls the capacity to integrate this abundance. The point is that our sense organs are actually blunted or crudely trained when we consider their enormous potential. One need only mention here the ability of the Australian Aborigine to track an invisible trail, the musician who can sort out the various instruments of a symphony orchestra, the wine taster or the perfume mixer. Although any of the sensory modalities would be equally suitable, the tactile sense will be used here as an example of our sensory poverty in the midst of plenty. The skin serves many functions, but I'm not about to deliver a lecture on dermatologic physiology. Rather, I'll select just one of the prime functions of the skin, its role in communications. During the first few months of an infant's life, it is the most important pathway of transferring emotional messages. There is now sufficient evidence, both animal and human, to assert that prolonged severe deprivation of tactile stimulation during infancy can be seriously damaging to subsequent personality development. Spitz and Ribble have both related how infants, reared without fondling, cuddling, and other skin contacts, withdrew, regressed, and went into a depression, which terminated in death in some instances. In certain animal species, unless the mother licks the neonate soon after birth, it will die. It has been demonstrated that rats, handled for short periods daily, tolerate stress and have a faster growing central nervous system than their littermates who are unhandled. In the human infant, stroking and hugging appears to provide not only a pleasurable response, but also engenders feelings of safety, which become a part of the core of security required for subsequent exploratory behavior. There is indeed in the human a sort of tactile hunger. This may last a lifetime. In the infant, one can really speak of contact deprivation, a part of the maternal deprivation syndrome which we now can identify. And to summarize the maternal deprivation literature in a sentence, it seems to be that mothering is vital, but mothers probably aren't. As the child grows older, many of the emotional messages are still conveyed across the skin. Love is, in good measure, a cutaneous game. It's unnecessary for me to elaborate on caressing, petting, and all the reported dermal and mucosal elaborations of these practices. I think these are fairly well known. The handshake remains a symbol of friendliness, and more contracts are still consummated with the clasp of the hands and with the stroke of a pen. The most subtle of messages can be conveyed across the body's surface. Consider the kiss. It can mean anything from a circumoral encounter of surpassing tenderness, indescribable with words, to a peck which explicitly says, "I hate you, but let's be civilized." Unfortunately, I think, in our culture, adult skin contacts, over and above a few tentative and superficial ones, are either expressions of aggression or sexuality. We convey a wide range of emotions audiovisually rather than cutaneously. This is rather unfortunate, for it's easiest to dissimulate with the voice or the muscles of mimicry and posture. The skin tells the truth much more often. The lie detector depends to a good measure on the galvanic skin reflex. The inherent capacity of the skin to receive messages other than emotional is also impressive. A blind man can read a book with his fingers almost as adeptly as we can with our eyes, and better if we've misplaced our spectacles. You may be familiar with another skin language, vibrates, the basic alphabet of which is vibration. By altering the intensity, the duration, or the location of the signal, the trained vibratician can read faster than the Morse code expert. This mode of communication demonstrates how smart our skin can become. Its development is not to provide a substitute for Braille, nor will it become a laboratory curiosity. It may one day come into use in complex operations where the human must totally employ his hearing and vision for constant scanning activities under emergency conditions, in outer space, for example. Under such contingencies, he could still receive dermal messages rapidly and precisely. These are a few examples of how exquisitely a trained tactile sense can be refined to receive either minute differences in feeling tone or rational signals with precision. They are cited to demonstrate how fractional a portion of our cutaneous sensory potential is accessible to most of us. Only recently, in a very tentative way, have certain schools begun to deliberately offer children a bit of training of the senses by exposure to a variety of colors, textures, patterns, and forms, along with some appreciation of the sensory experience. It's evident that some trained individuals can receive sensory cues which the rest of us miss. This might be called the Sherlock Holmes syndrome and would include the clinician of the past who could diagnose typhoid with a nose, the skillful fortune teller who senses her client's problems and their probable future solution, and so forth. But now let's go on to what I called metasensory perception. Recently, the skin has been accused of a further propensity, well beyond those already accredited to it, the ability of certain people to identify color and words with their fingertips, even to the extent of reading Pravda with their elbows. Up to this moment, I've read a few articles on this subject. One was the Life piece of about a year ago, which I hope all of you have seen. It was called Seeing Color with the Fingers. One from Soviet Life Today called A Sixth Sense, which, by the way, is quite an understatement. We have many more than six senses. And another from the spring 1964 issue of Soviet Psychology and Psychiatry on The Nature of the Cutaneous Optical Sense in Man by Novomaisky. Dermo-optical perception, as light reception by the skin is called, is a most interesting phenomenon from many points of view. First of all, it violates our established notions about optics and raises questions which are not definitely answered at this time. It's also an exercise in how much evidence is necessary for each one of us to make up our mind that dermo-optical perception is or is not a valid phenomenon. Furthermore, if it is a veridical experience, what is the explanation? Well, let's go over some of the high points that I've been able to cull from these articles I've mentioned. It's also called the Tactile phenomenon because Rosa Kuslova of Nizhny Tagil in the Urals in 1962 was the first person thoroughly studied. A few sporadic reports of similar experiences had been made in the past, some as early as the 18th century. Jules Romain, in fact, wrote a book called Eyeless Sight, which was never given much credence. It's said that training can produce some degree of tactile color discrimination in 10 to 20% of all people. Furthermore, although one begins the training process by rubbing the fingers over various colors and getting a variety of sensations from the color, it's unnecessary by the experts to directly touch the colored surface. Dermo-optical perception can exceed ocular vision in highly gifted individuals, in that some degree of color identification is retained in the dark, or when colored paper is placed under opaque sheets of aluminum or copper. Rosa and a few others can read small print, not only with the fingertips, but with the elbows. Well, several studies are going on right now here and abroad, and hopefully much more definite information will be available soon. A number of theories have been suggested to explain this phenomenon, none of which are capable of really explaining all the observed data. For example, minute differences in texture may explain the beginner's ability to discriminate with practice, but not those made at a distance or of colors on the metal or glass. An extraordinary ability to sense the difference in heat given off by each color, and indeed it does vary minutely, is likewise disproven by passing colored light through water filters and onto screens. Apparently, such colors can still be identified. It doesn't seem to be analogous to the perception of light photons as the eye perceives them when they impinge on the retina. The eye could not distinguish color in a light-proof box or when the color is covered by copper or aluminum foil. Nor is it a matter of telepathy, because tests have been done in which the investigator does not know which color was being handled at the time. However, clairvoyance is not ruled out, and ESP protagonists are hopeful that this may be the explanation. Novomaisky speaks of an electrical color field because the color can be identified when covered with an opaque surface, which is charged, but not one which is grounded. Now, what does all this mean? What should we believe now at our present level of information? Well, first of all, we're aware that certain animals, particularly fish, do have photoreceptors in various parts of their body, so that a phylogenetic vestige could exist. What is strange to me is that if the ability to sense light is latent in 1/6 of the population, why shouldn't we have been aware of it long since, particularly in those groups of individuals who must acquire a highly trained tactile sense, that is, the blind? The fact that signals from the skin go to areas of the brain not involved with vision does not altogether rule out the possibility that dermo-optical perception occurs. For we know that sensory synesthesias are possible. These are crossovers from one sensory modality to another. In a way, we've all experienced dermo-optical perception. When we sustained a hard blow on the head, we saw stars. Therefore, the connections between tactile neurons and the visual cortex can exist. However, it ordinarily takes a very strong stimulus to produce a synesthetic response. On the other hand, there is a group of drugs, the hallucinogens, which permits us to experience synesthesias even at ordinary intensities of sensation. Under the influence of drugs like LSD, mescaline, psilocybin, and so forth, the subject may speak of the patterns which sounds produce, the scent of music, even the effect of a change of mood upon the colors that are seen. But to get back to dermo-optical perception, what should we believe now on the basis of the available reports? Those of us who are less critical and who are quite ready to accept new notions might be inclined to say that it's dermo-optical perception is a fact. At the other extreme, I'm sure there's a group who are highly cautious and who change their established beliefs with some difficulty. They'll say it's impossible or it's a trick. It seems to me that neither attitude is ideal. The first tends to make us gullible, and we come to believe much that turns out to be nonsensical. The second closes our mind too tightly to entirely new constructs. As a result, we might miss the periodic shattering of our belief system, which seems to be a part of living, especially in this century. I would submit that in instances of this sort, dermo-optical perception being only an available example, that we keep a suspense file. Items are put in there which are possible but unproven, and that we keep open to many notions but await further evidence. It would seem best to be neither credulous nor incredulous. This might mean that most of our beliefs, especially such eternal questions as what am I, what does it all mean, and so forth, would have to be put into the suspense file, and a rather permanent one. This is true. We appear to know little for sure. Many of our beliefs, especially those, oddly enough, most tightly held, are based upon faith, not proof. We're only 2 or 3 centuries into the rationalistic, mechanistic, scientific revolution. It began as a result against superstition, ignorance, and stubborn dogma. It was embraced by those who wanted to know nature by test, not testament. The history of science is replete with new laws overthrowing old established ones. As knowledge accrues, the old theory becomes less and less tenable. Finally, someone propounds a new paradigm, which is a better explanation for the data than the prevailing one, and it's accepted. Well, how do scientists, those advocates of reason and new ideas, change their minds in the face of irrefutable evidence? All too often they do not. Copernicus was called mad by his colleagues because he stated that the earth moved, when patently it did not. His work was not accepted for almost a century after his death. For a while, no one would even look through Galileo's telescope. Newton met with a similar dogmatic rejection during his lifetime. Priestley never did relinquish his phlogiston in favor of Lavoisier's oxygen theory. Lord Kelvin, who contributed much to physics, called X-rays a hoax and Maxwell's electromagnetic theory nonsense. Both Darwin and Planck predicted that their views would not be accepted until their contemporaries died off, and they were right. Resistance to a major reconstruction of long-held scientific views is by no means invariable. Witness the rather rapid acceptance of Einstein's revolutionary ideas. It does remind us, though, that scientists are human and tend to have emotional investments in their established beliefs. They are apt to be as rigid and closed to the new as anyone else. This should not be surprising, except that we idealize a scientist as being open-minded and willing to entertain constructs with which he does not agree. this is probably less true than we imagine. This diversion into belief systems is by no means a straying off the track. Concepts come before percepts. We cannot see what we cannot conceive. When a new paradigm is adopted, the person looks at the old percepts in a new way. Uranus was seen at least 17 times by various observers and called a star. Finally, after 100 years of sightings, Herschel insisted that it had planetary movement. This was after all the planets had been discovered, you know. After that, everyone saw it as a planet. So as you see, even sensory communication is fallible, especially when the communication has an emotional charge to it. And so we come to the third part of the talk today, the issue of extrasensory communication. I disagree with Chancellor Murphy when he says that I have some particular knowledge of this field. Really, I can only claim to have done one minor little experiment in this area. This was a number of years ago, and it was done in connection with some other work that was ongoing. It was an attempt to stabilize the phenomenon of extrasensory perception with drugs. One of the annoying things about extrasensory perception is that it's not quite reliable. It isn't reproducible. And one wondered whether drugs like lysergic acid diethylamide might perhaps help fix it in those who had it, or keep it away from those who didn't. Well, we simply had our subjects sort Rhine cards. I'm sure you all know what Rhine cards are. They're also called Zehner cards. They have one of 5 different figures on them: star, cross, and so forth. And we asked our subjects to sort them into piles while sober, and then while under the influence of lysergic acid. I might report that they did no better under lysergic acid than they did before they took the drug, but that is of no great consequence. It was a small series and had no particular meaning. Other drugs have been used for the same purpose. The Russians have used mescaline, alcohol has been used, barbiturates, stimulants, and so forth. To date, oddly enough, the drug which gives the best results is alcohol. I merely relate this brief incident to be perfectly honest with you as to my qualifications in this matter. However, I was forced into it, and I have done some homework. And I'd like to talk with you about my impressions of the extrasensory perception literature. Just in case there is anyone here who's dubious about what extrasensory perception or parapsychology or the psi phenomenon is, let me immediately say that it ranges from the transference of thoughts by non-sensory means, which is telepathy, to the ability to obtain information from inanimate objects, which is clairvoyance, to the ability to influence inanimate objects, which is psychokinesis, the capacity to know events before they occur, precognition, and this goes on to very recondite matters such as automatic writing, glossolalia, or the ability to speak in tongues unknown to the subject, reincarnation with the ability to remember something of the previous existence, and communications with the departed via a medium. One of the first things I discovered in wading through this literature was that there were 2 kinds of parapsychologists, just as there are no doubt 2 kinds of scientists. There was what might be called a square parapsychologist who uses scientific methods to design his experiments. He uses very approved statistical treatment of the results and very rigid controls. And these could be epitomized by such people as Rhine and Pratt, Schmeidler, Murphy. By the way, three of those four will be here in June, and many others. Then there are the further out parapsychologists who are rather contemptuous of efforts to scientifically prove these paranormal phenomena by using scientific criteria of predictability, reproducibility, the ideas of the physical transmission of energy and of cause-effect relationships. Actually, these two groups dislike each other more than they dislike the scientists. Well, I'm not qualified to evaluate the evidence of what might be called parascientific parapsychology. These are the anecdotes, narrative reports of poltergeists, astral projections, discarnate entities who communicate with the living through mediums, possessed personalities, ectoplasmic apparitions, psychic healing, and so forth. I've read a good deal of the material. It's fascinating. I can only say it takes an act of faith, not of reason, to believe in these matters, and I'm not diminishing it by saying this. There may be things that are not amenable to the rational, reasonable mind. In fact, I'm sure many of you believe there are. Some of these occult events do seem to border a bit upon the psychopathic, but not necessarily so. The mere fact that some of the practitioners are obviously fraudulent does not necessarily condemn the entire literature on these esoteric occurrences. I think this is important. And this is what discourages many investigators, especially the disbelievers, that they say, oh, well, he's a fraud, and he's obviously a fraud, and Houdini found him to be a fraud, and they throw everything out, and maybe they're throwing something quite valuable out. Now, what I would like to deal with are the square or scientific parapsychologists, because I understand them better. These are the ones, as I said, who attempt to use the methods of science in proving their thesis. They have worked primarily in the area of telepathy and clairvoyance, and to a lesser degree with precognition and psychokinesis. Well, the first experiments in this field were faulty in many respects, but in the 1930s at Duke University, Pearson Pratt conducted a clairvoyant-type experiment which seems to have met all the technical objections. With the experimenter and subject 100 yards apart in different buildings, stacks of Rhine cards were guessed at a level far beyond chance. Since then, similar results have been obtained in what appears to be well-designed experiments. Seoul in London and the Schmeidlers in New York have also had experimental series in which above-chance results were obtained. In other series of identical tests, no significant deviations from a chance distribution were obtained. The criteria for a thoroughgoing ESP piece of research should include a number of things. For example, the target, cards or dice or whatever, should be truly randomized. And in the case of telepathic experiments, one would have to avoid investigators and subjects with parallel mental habits. There must be an absolute avoidance of sensory leakage. Sensory cues might occur during involuntary articulation with a hyperacoustic subject. Muscle reading can be a cue. Changes in the rate of the breathing of the investigator might give a tip. In the studies where very large series of guesses are used, if a single cue occurs in every 100 guesses, a significant score could result. Furthermore, everything must be recorded and reported. Recording errors must be searched for by at least 2 independent observers. there must be at least one record of the experiment which cannot be subsequently altered. And I would add a responsible disbeliever should be included as an observer. During the course of these past 30 years, at least, of parapsychological investigation, a number of characteristics of this phenomena have been uncovered. For example, it was found that scores tend to decline toward the chance level after the first run, that the subject's belief or disbelief in the SP had an effect upon his scoring pattern, and that the subject-investigator interaction was important. Interest in parapsychology is worldwide. The current preoccupation with Soviet parapsychological efforts doesn't seem to stem so much from the elegance of their methodological approach or their precision in studying the paraphenomena, but rather that such work should occur at all in a materialistic, mechanistic society. I've read Vasiliev's book and was rather unimpressed. I understand there's a new one coming out which hopefully will describe his more recent work. The ability to replicate and predict the results of ESP experiments has not been completely achieved to this moment. Nevertheless, an enormous amount of data has accumulated in clairvoyance, for example, which shows statistically significant results. Gertrude Schmeidler and her colleagues have some 24 large series of test runs in which her sheep, those who believe in the SP, did better than chance, and her goats, those who did not believe in the SP, did worse than chance. This did not happen in every experimental series, but did in the majority of them. When one reads of her controls, the cars being sealed in random order in packages of 25 out of sight of the subject, her statistical treatment and so forth, it's difficult to say what was defective in the experimental design and why it is not convincing proof that the phenomenon does actually exist. Still, it must be remembered that as many as 90% of all the SP experiments merely affirm the null hypothesis. What should be said of Soule's precognitive telepathic experiments with Shackleton, which were so far beyond chance? Shackleton's total score exceeded chance by 10 to the 35th to 1. That's 35 zeros after 10 to 1 probability. Enormously remote, but still a probability. And we must remember that there are probabilities not ascribable to parapsychological phenomena which can have such a remote likelihood. For example, perhaps you've read of the series of very interesting coincidences about Lincoln and Kennedy's assassination. I haven't heard that anyone ascribes a paranormal relationship between the two events, but I'll quickly run through a few of these coincidences, and you will, if you are willing to calculate the probability of these coincidences, they too may come to 10 to the 35th to 1. For example, there's a 100-year coincidence. Lincoln was elected in 1860, Kennedy in 1960. Booth was born in 1839, Oswald in 1939. Andrew Johnson, born in 1808, Lyndon Johnson in 1908. Both men were slain on a Friday in the presence of their wives. The successors, of course, to the presidents were both named Johnson. Both Johnson had served in the Senate. Both of the Johnsons were Southerners. The slayers of both Booth and Oswald were murdered by assassins. Pardon me, let me say that one again. The slayers of both Booth and Oswald murdered the assassins before a trial could be arranged. Both presidents' wives had lost children in death while in the White House, I believe these were the only children lost in death in the White House, but I'm not sure of that. President Lincoln's secretary, a man named Kennedy, advised him not to go to the theater. President Kennedy's secretary, named Lincoln, advised him not to go to Dallas. And one could go on and on. For example, both Lincoln and Kennedy had 7 letters in their last name. And if you add up the number of letters in John Wilkes Booth and Lee Harvey Oswald, they're both the same number. What is one to say to these coincidences? I point them out merely to indicate that coincidence alone is not enough. Well then, should we say as G.B. Price did in Science about 8 years ago, and I quote, "Positive ESP findings are dependent on clerical or statistical errors or unintentional use of sensory cues. All extra chance results, not so explicable, are dependent upon deliberate fraud or mildly abnormal mental conditions," unquote. Well, this, I think, is a very extreme position to take, and if we apply this to other scientific or other matters, we would never get anywhere. For example, if at the time of the discovery of radioactivity by the Curies, in which uranium was found to change to barium, the chemists of the day had said, and some of them did, this is impossible, it's fraudulent. Where would we have been with the progress of physics and chemistry on the basis of the Curie discovery? The mere demonstration of a non-chance deviation is not enough. It's the lack of a testable theory, the inability to provide an operational definition, which is lacking in ESP almost as much as additional data. After all, new data never displaced an old hypothesis. It's only a new hypothesis that does this. Well, I've been looking for theories, and I've come up with 2 regarding ESP that are interesting to me. Marshall, in an attempt to explain telepathy, speculated that the laws that hold for physics may not apply to highly complex organizations like the brain and, of course, the mind. As the structure becomes more complex, its properties change. The chemical structure of the neurons of a squid, which has 1 cell, and the brain cells of a human are fairly similar. Yet such new characteristics of the human nervous system as consciousness, cognitive learning, and self-awareness is a product of its great complexity. Complex but similar structures may have properties of resonance with each other. Since thoughts and emotions are patterns of neuronal activity in an intricate but indeterminate system, such patterns may be capable of resonating outside of the accepted time-space relationships. Telepathy is an erratic communicative process because of the many distortions to which it is subject, that is, the noise, as the physicists call it, which consists of competing informational input, difficulties in extracting the telepathic material and bringing it to awareness, and so forth. Another interesting theoretical model was suggested by Gardner Murphy. He says, first of all, the possibility that the action current of the brain, which is measured by the brain waves or the EEG, that the possibility that this accounts for the transfer of ESP information is absolutely untenable. He thinks that an entirely different modality is essential to understand and test ESP, a vehicle not yet incorporated in our present hypotheses of physics. However, physics is changing, and some radical revisions in our understanding of space and time may clarify the impasse in explaining parapsychological events. It may be that using our present scientific concepts, psychic phenomena will never be reproducible or predictable, the usual criteria of normal science. He also points out that it's not new information that must be accounted for, but a new way of transposing and transmitting it from one space-time region to another that is the essence of parapsychological communication. Much that we know about perception is applicable to extrasensory perception, but a crucial difference is as yet undiscovered means of transmittal. These similarities would include such things as motivation, in which both perception and apparently extrasensory perception increase as there is an increased motivation to do well in the experimental situation, or a decrement in the results when there's boredom, disinterest, or hostility to the investigator. Well, these are interesting hypotheses, and with imagination, portions of them may become subject to verification. I'd like to summarize some of the things I've been saying. Perhaps my reluctance to take a firm position out at either end of the spectrum may confuse you. I prefer to remain a dead center in this, or rather ground zero perhaps would be a more likely thing, because I have a feeling I've made enemies of everyone in here tonight. But I refuse to take an extreme position. I'm open but unconvinced, let's say. And so, to clarify that position, let me summarize. 1, there is still much to be learned about sensory perception and the education of the senses. Our inability to cognize minute sensory signals may explain a fair amount of what is now called psi phenomena. This sensing may be intensified when higher organisms are in tune, or as Marshall said, resonating. Then, rather reliable sender-receiver communications could be possible. But this is, in the end, sensory, not extrasensory communication. It's just that we've learned more about it. 2, the scientist, that arbiter of what should and should not be believed, is unfortunately himself all too often guilty of rigidity, tunnel vision, and emotionalism in holding to outworn hypotheses. 3, even if all of psi phenomena were one day found to be artifacts, we still should have learned much about the psychology of belief systems in investigating them. 4, the tendency of parapsychologists to take over areas which remain unexplained by science is not good strategy. Books on ESP written only a decade ago suggest, for example, that the migration of birds is ascribable to some intrinsic ESP power in them. Today, we know something about the ability of migrating flocks to go long distances by means of celestial navigation and by sensing the Earth's magnetic field. And when one reads such things in books not too old, one is inclined to be disenchanted. 5, parapsychological experiments should become more interdisciplinary. Non-believing but not disruptive psychologists, engineers, and physicists ought to be included from the beginning to the end of the investigation as consultants in design and as close observers. Finally, even if ESP would require a complete revision of our current notions of time and space, this alone is not sufficient cause to reject it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cohen, for this most impressive verbal communication in our series. It's the very auspicious beginning to this series on nonverbal communication. Dr. Cohen has kindly consented to respond to a few questions, and we do have microphones which will be available to people in the audience, so that I think the procedure we shall follow is, if you would stand or raise your hand, try to catch my eye, I will designate someone, and our ushers will bring the microphone to you.
I might say that it is interesting, isn't it, Professor Schwartz, that every one of these speakers, I predict, including myself, will depend upon the word rather than the non-word in communicating with you. What does this mean? It merely means, I think, that the word has a great precision, and we shouldn't derogate it. It is a part of man's most priceless heritage, the ability to symbolize, and we shouldn't run it down. We shouldn't run reason down. So thank you for reminding me that I used words tonight instead of standing up here just sending messages.
I did detect a great deal of resonance, though, in the audience. Does anyone have a question? The gentleman in the very back of the room, I'm not sure, is the microphone available yet for this side?
Not just
Let's
yet.
take someone on the other side.
If it isn't available, I'd like to add to the announcement I made earlier, namely that there will be somebody outside you can give your name to receive a preliminary program on this June 5th, 6th meeting. A young lady will take your name and send you a program if you're interested.
Are we ready?
Doctor?
This gentleman right here.
How can anyone who's never had any subjective experience of his own take any position but the middle of the road?
I didn't hear the last part of the...
How could anybody who's never had any subjective experience of his own in the field of extrasensory or allied phenomena take anything but a center position unless he wanted to be firm for egotistical reasons or otherwise?
The opposite question could also be asked. How could anyone who has had a subjective experience of some such phenomenon be an impartial, unbiased reporter? You see, you're caught in the clutch of a bind. Those who have experience believe; those who do not believe do not experience. Seems to be the rule.
Doctor, I have a lady over here.
Dr. Colin?
Keep her.
Doctor, is there much in the way of current research going on, or is there any current research going on the West Coast? If not, why not? And is anything that might be currently being done, is it of this laboratory nature type of experiment that you described?
There is very little that I know of going on at the West Coast. The Idelson Foundation is sponsoring a study down in the La Jolla area. There was one study done here this summer at UCLA in the psychology department. There is an endowment up at Stanford for psychic research, but I haven't heard any reports of it. It's rather meager. However, the overall experimentation is not quite that bad. You know, of course, of Dr. Rhine's laboratory at Duke, which has a $7 million endowment. Many in Europe, Holland, England is a great center for good parapsychological research, and so forth. Much of it is an attempt to put into the laboratory and treat as, quote, scientifically, unquote, as possible, these very unusual phenomena.
There was a gentleman in the back whom I try to recognize at the outset, towards behind the gentleman who's standing. Yeah. Go ahead, if you would.
As a psychiatrist, have you done any thinking on how resonance might be developed in a maturing individual?
If I may still retain the meaning of your question, may I rephrase it and ask, how can we become more sensitive to each other? I think this is the gist of what you're asking.
Yes, it is.
To the ultimate, whatever that might be, indeed, resonance without words. Well, this would take a book, wouldn't it, to deal with? I think I can't answer that one briefly. It's a vast subject, and I think it would be an injustice to deal with it in just a few sentences, sir.
The gentleman right here.
Dr. Cohen, you have quoted Dr. Murphy as in relation to the amplification of brain waves to explain thought transference as having brushed it off. But you didn't elaborate further. We are familiar with the researches being done in the electrodes placed in certain brain centers and creating an effect upon that individual. The taking of electroencephalograms is a common medical practice, the measurement of brain waves. I would like to hear you go into that subject and let us know what has been done and what your reaction to that is.
Thank you, sir. The amplitude and magnitude of the current that is generated by the brain's activity is extremely minute. It's in the order of microvolts. It's so small that to take an electroencephalogram, you have to amplify it enormously, so that if you use the accepted physical laws of the inverse square of the distance, that is, energy decreasing with the square of the distance, the distances between individuals would have to be awfully, well, there'd have to be an awful lot of togetherness to have a transmission of via this modality, namely the action current of the brain. And we have claims, some of them mighty impressive, really, of people hundreds and thousands of miles away receiving and sending messages to each other. This could hardly be explained on what we know of electromagnetic energy transmission, of which the brain current is supposed to be a part. And I would agree with Dr. Murphy that it's sort of hopeless to think that our brain waves go out and can be perceived over any distance whatsoever.
How about the gentleman over on the far aisle standing now? Would you take the microphone up to him, or would he come to the microphone?
While the gentleman is coming to the microphone, I might tell you something that Dr. Murphy said when he was here last May. He said, it's all right if you are in one way out field, your colleagues will still tolerate you. And this, of course, is a story of Dr. Murphy's life. He's president of the American Society for Psychical Research, but he is extremely well known for his more stolid researches in perception, child development, and so forth. He is a remarkable man. I'm going to take his advice seriously. I think I am already way out in the area of LSD, and I'd better abandon the area of ESP.
The gentleman on the side.
Yes, Doctor, without misinterpreting what you said, I think you suggested that for scientific experimentation in the field of ASP that you shouldn't use people who have relatively similar emotional patterns. And I wondered why you said this, since I think that many married couples have experienced the feelings of transfer of thought in this particular mode.
This was specifically with regards to the relationship between the investigator and his subject. After all, if the investigator and his subject have parallel mental habits, then we can attribute any beyond chance scores that they make to these parallel mental habits rather than to non-sensory or extrasensory phenomena which they may possess. It was only in that context, not in the context of what we might call random telepathic occurrences which are anecdotal and which are not within the laboratory situation. I agree that sensitives should be used and pairs of sensitives should be used, but then they should be separated and their task should not allow them to use, if they are sensitive in pairs, as identical twins are supposed to be, for example, they should not, their task should not allow them to employ their, what for lack of a better word, might be called parallel mental habits.
There's a gentleman in the far row of the balcony who has his hand up. I'm not sure we can hear your question, sir, but we'll try.
Doctor, are you familiar with one Casey, formerly of Virginia, who had a lot of dealings with ESP? My question is, have they ever evaluated his service? And what is your conclusion?
I am familiar with it. I can offer you nothing more than anyone else on this. It's fabulous, stirring, interesting. In other words, I can't give you an evaluation of it.
The gentleman right here.
Dr. Cohen, the suggestion you make of having a skeptic present at any serious investigation implies that if an investigator ruled out skeptics and did not allow them in, therefore we would hold him in serious question that everyone there was favorably inclined, there were no skeptics to verify. Now, I'd like to postulate a possibility that could complicate this requirement. And that is, if what you are trying to measure is something where the mind or the human organism is receiving information which comes through some sort of vibratory process or some diffusion process from outside the organism, and this is a hypersensitivity, wouldn't the skeptic quite possibly be a noise generator in such an atmosphere and in effect be jamming the communications by virtue of his skepticism? So you'd never be able to find it.
What are people applauding for? You notice you've not taken the words out of my mouth. I didn't use the word skeptic. I used the word non-believer. I think you needn't believe and still be open and not interfere, not be an interfering personality. I certainly agree with you that a lot depends upon the set of the group or of the two individuals, the investigator and the subject. And indeed, this is phenomenal in work with the hallucinogens, for example. I don't think that a proper unbeliever would be disrupting. I agree with you that someone who is completely negativistic might be.
We have the lady in the red coat right here.
Doctor, you mentioned the work being done at La Jolla. Could you tell us a little bit about this and who is carrying it on?
It's an effort, I believe, I'm really not very familiar with it, but it's an effort to measure the interaction of the creative process and the parapsychological process. And I think very creative people are being used to study this thing. There is a group there, and I don't know a number of the names. A psychiatrist down there is involved in the, I think is the leader of the group, but I'm not even sure of that.
Right, we have this gentleman right here.
Why UCLA refuses to accept grants for investigating this field? What is their bias toward investigating ESP?
I think you have to recognize, ladies and gentlemen, that this whole issue of parapsychology is not simply a matter of new knowledge. If indeed it is to be acceptable, it means that our entire notions of time and space must be reconstructed. Therefore, as I said before, we have a lot of good data, but the scientific community isn't about to change that notion until a good theory of how to explain this new data is arrived at. And you may be right. I don't know that they are refusing grants for parapsychological investigations. They may be. I'll assume that they are. If so, it, to me, is a slightly closed mind. On the other hand, I can understand it because they feel it is not a profitable area of investigation.
On behalf of the Committee on Public Lectures, again, I wish to thank Dr. Cohen for initiating this series.